You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
One of the problems with recording a podcast like this for so many years is that it's difficult to recall everything I've said. I mean, there's always that risk that I'm going to start repeating myself. And the story that I'm about to tell you is one that seems oddly familiar, like, I've told it before. So maybe I have and maybe I haven't. Now, if you're a longtime listener to the podcast and have heard what I'm about to say before, I do apologize in advance. And basically, I hate snakes. And it's not like I run in fear for them or anything like that, but I simply have no desire ever to handle one. And as I've mentioned before, my parents owned a pet shop in Monticello, New York for about 25 years. And yes, they sold snakes. But my parents kept them in glass tanks with secure lids in a glass cabinet, and it had a keyed lock on it. So theoretically, there was no way that any snake could escape. That is, until the occasional one did. Now, I was teaching about 2 hours away from my parents' store, so I'd only go to visit when I was on vacation. And it was while I was on one of these visits that my mom mentioned to me that one of their ball pythons had escaped. And they had searched everywhere, but were unable to locate the animal. The assumption was that either the snake escaped out of the store into the wild, or it had hidden itself so well inside the store that it eventually died of starvation. Well, many months go by and I once again drove down to visit. And I usually spent most of the time, cleaning fish tanks, dusting the shelves, and simply, doing whatever needed to be done. Then my mom asked me to go into their storeroom and grab a small box that the pest control guy had left behind. And it contained several of those classic brown boxes of rodent bait. Yes, it was poison. The problem was that the box was way up high on a shelf, nearly 12 feet or 3.7 meters off the ground. So I grabbed the tallest ladder, which of course wasn't even close to the height that I needed, and I did exactly what you're not supposed to do. I stood on the highest step of the ladder, the one that warns you never to stand on that one, and I reached out for that small box. Well, you can probably guess what happened next. I peered inside that tiny little box of poison, and to my surprise, the missing python was coiled up inside. And instinctively, I just jerked backwards and the ladder nearly fell over. But luckily, I was able to quickly reach out and grab hold of the wire shelving, and that saved me from crashing into the concrete floor below, and probably also saved me from having a few broken bones. Now, as I said, that story seems oddly familiar, like I've told it before on this podcast. But then maybe I haven't. What I am certain of is that the snake story I'm about to tell you is totally new to this podcast. And this snake, well, it was a lot larger than the baby python that disappeared in my parents' store. So sit back and enjoy the fantastic story of Pete the Python. It's just a fun story about what happens when a giant snake gets loose and no one can find it. Plus, I'll tell you this in advance, it has a big surprise near the end, and it's something that no one saw coming, not even the snake's owner. I am Steve Silverman, and this is the Useless Information Podcast.
Useless information.
Let's start with a simple question. That's one I have to tell you I don't know the answer to. If your plane sets you down in some location and you never leave the airport, can you really claim that you were there? For example, years ago I somehow ended up in Frankfurt, Germany while on my way to Barcelona. But, of course, I never left the airport, although I did get that German stamp in my passport. Then, after waiting a while, I boarded another plane and flew off to Barcelona. So I guess, have I ever been to Germany? I guess I have, but I don't really feel like I have. Well, today's story kind of falls into that situation for me. That's because I've only set foot in Texas twice, and both times were due to layovers while traveling to and from Merida, Mexico nearly 20 years ago. So does that mean I've been to Texas? I guess technically I was a tourist in Texas who never visited a single tourist attraction while there. But if I had the chance to travel around the state, one of the attractions I would have liked to have visited was the Fort Worth Zoo. and that's also known as the Forest Park Zoo. It's located within the city's Forest Park, hence the name, and it sits along the southern bank of the Clear Fork branch of the Trinity River. And the reason I'd like to someday visit that zoo is because of the great story that I'm about to tell you. I just want to visit the place where it all took place. It was there in late March of 1951 that the operator of the zoo's reptile exhibit, that's a guy named Harry Jackson, or Snake Man Jackson, he eagerly awaited the arrival of some snakes from Thailand, although people were still referring to it as Siam back then. But I have to tell you, these weren't any ordinary snakes. This shipment included 2 6-foot or 1.84 meter cobras and 1 giant 16-foot or 4.88 meter long python. And for days before their arrival, the Fort Worth Press reported on the snakes' travel from Bangkok to their new homeland. They first traveled via KLM Airlines to Amsterdam, then to Idlewild Airport in New York, today we call that JFK, and from there the reptiles were trucked across the Hudson River to Newark Airport in New Jersey, and then they were loaded on a plane and taken to Dallas. The last leg of their journey was by truck to Fort Worth Municipal Airport, which today is known as Fort Worth Meacham International Airport. So on Wednesday, March 28th of 1951, Harry and his 4 assistants drove from the zoo to the airport to pick up those snakes. Those reptiles had been in transit for 8 days, so Harry opted to open the 4-foot or 1.2 meter square wooden shipping box right there at the airport. While he clearly did want to check on the health of his snakes, his main concern was that he wasn't cheated on size. As Harry explained,
I bought it with the understanding that it would be longer than 16 feet.
In what can only be described as a tense moment, a crowd looked on as Harry slowly pried open the top of the crate, his noose ready to snare that monstrous beast. But it didn't move. Sadly, that deadly cargo turned out to be, well, mostly dead. Harry again.
We've got a dead snake in there. I don't know what killed it. Maybe the altitude, maybe the cold, but I'm not going to pay for it. I bought it on the deal that it would be delivered alive.
The snake man then proceeded to check on his 2 cobras. So he removed a white cheesecloth sack from a small circular wire mesh cage and he began to make his examination. Unfortunately, one of the cobras didn't survive the trip. He then prodded the other snake and it barely responded.
He's alive, but not by much.
Harry Jackson assured everyone that he'd be cabling Bangkok to let them know that they needed to ship another python ASAP. And that's exactly what he did. A new python arrived 54 days later on Monday, May 21st of 1951. The purchase price was $265, which is about $3,160 today. This snake was even a bit longer. It was 17 feet or about 5.2 meters, and it was far more lively than the last one. Well, it was alive, so it had to be far more lively, right? After getting back to the zoo, Harry needed the assistance of 6 other men to transfer the python to its new glass enclosure. But before they did that, Harry pried open its mouth to check for signs of disease. As camera flashbulbs popped and the television cameras recorded the event, he announced that the snake was
a healthy specimen.
Next, they turned their attention to another crate that was labeled simply 4 Cobras, Bangkok. And just as in the previous shipment, Harry carefully removed the wire crate from the box. He took a peek inside and declared that all the snakes were dead. He then signaled to the reporters and told them to come over and take a look
at a bunch of dead cobras.
And just as they began to take a peek inside, the head of one of the deadly cobras suddenly popped its head out. Harry swiftly grabbed the snake from behind its head and shoved raw eggs down its throat, remarking that the snake
looked a little puny.
But once again, sadly, the other 3 cobras didn't survive the trip. Now, while this was happening, no one was paying attention to the python. he discovered that one end of his cage wasn't tightly sealed and he began to make his getaway. But he had only managed to slither about 1/3 of his body out of the enclosure before being spotted and wrestled back inside. Now, inviting the press to witness the arrival of these snakes, even if the bulk of them had died while in transit, it proved to be an advertising bonanza for the zoo. And that's because more people came to get a glimpse of this python, now named Pete the Python, than any other animal that they had on display. The zoo's snake exhibit would be open during the warmer months, but after it closed in the fall, Pete and all the other snakes would spend their winters inside of their monkey house. But Pete was never allowed to socialize, and that includes when he was on display in the snake pit. There he was housed in a 6-foot or 1.83 meter long display box, and it sat about 3 feet or 1 meter off the ground. Well, that would all change during Pete's 3rd season with the zoo. On Sunday, June 28th of 1953, Harry Jackson turned Pete loose to mingle among the other snakes. And I should point out this is all a publicity stunt designed to draw in big crowds, and everything did go well the first time that they tried it. But that wasn't true with the second attempt. At first, everything seemed to be going smoothly. But as they attempted to remove Python Pete from the snake pit, he sank his teeth right into Harry's right hand. The packed crowd looked on in horror as 6 men fought to get the snake to release its grip. It took nearly 10 minutes to get Pete to let go. Ouch. Well, afterward, Harry declared,
"This second time out was the last time."
But amazingly, he wasn't upset with the snake. He was actually more concerned with its welfare, adding that
"We're liable to hurt him."
Pete the Python would once again make headlines 1 year later. That's because normally Pete would eat a whole chicken, that's feathers and all, every 2 weeks. However, he hadn't eaten anything in over 7 weeks. And after careful observation, it was determined that Pete had a toothache. So on Wednesday, August 18th of 1954, a human dentist was called in to remove one of his teeth. However, once the 6 men managed to get the snake under control, they found out that his tooth was fine. It was his gums that were infected. They then treated his mouth with penicillin and returned him back to his enclosure. Then at 9:30 a.m. on Saturday, September 18th, 1954, that's about a month later, Harry Jackson checked on Pete's cage and noticed something unusual. That is that the live chicken that was placed in at noon the previous day, it was still alive. But even worse, Pete the Python was long gone. The last sighting of Pete was at 2 p.m. on Friday, the previous day. A careful examination of his cage revealed that Pete had pushed aside a section of the tin door through which he was fed. My hunch is that when they put the chicken in, they didn't secure that door properly. Anyway, after escaping, he made his way through the snake pit and he scaled the 8-foot or 2.4 meter high fence that surrounded the exhibit. The zoo's employees immediately sprang into action and launched a search park-wide for Pete. Of course, the authorities were contacted and the police dispatched 9 patrol cars and all available motorcycle officers. The fire department, they asked all their off-duty officers to volunteer, plus word was sent out to all civil defense auxiliary policemen. In other words, there were a lot of people hunting for Pete. An estimated 4,000 people had been visiting the park and they wondered what the heck was going on. There's all this commotion, but they had no clue. Well, they soon learned the reason. Loudspeakers that were mounted on a traffic car and a police radio truck, they moved through the zoo, repeatedly announcing,
"A large reptile has escaped from the zoo. It is necessary to clear the park for your safety."
You know what happened next. Panic set in. People began running for the exits. Parents clutched their children tightly, urging them to run faster and faster, while others stumbled and fell in the frenzy. It was a heart-pounding mix of terror, destruction, and desperate survival. Oh wait, no. That describes a scene from a Godzilla movie. The reality was very different. There was no sense of alarm, and everyone left the zoo at a leisurely pace. Zoo Director Lawrence Curtis attempted to reassure the public that there was no need to fear if the snake ended up in someone's home or their backyard. He explained that Pete was unlikely to attack anyone. He also pointed out there had only been 2 documented cases of a python crushing and eating a human, and both involved infants. As for Pete, his diet was mostly chickens, and he had eaten 3 weeks prior, and they felt that would satisfy his appetite for about a month. Curtis said,
"If he were molested or hungry, he might. But he's not hungry, and he's too excited with his newly found freedom to bother anyone."
However, Curtis didn't address one of my biggest concerns, and that is what would happen if Pete saw your little dog Toto running through the woods. You know exactly what Pete would be thinking. Dinner! One would think it'd be easy to spot an 18-foot, 150-pound snake, that's about 5.5 meters and 68 kilograms, but it was not. By noon, no trace of the reptile had been found. It was theorized that Pete would instinctively head for the river, so horsemen were brought in to do a thorough search along its banks. And if he did truly make it to the river, he could have swum in just about any direction. He could be anywhere. The first clue emerged around 1:30 p.m. when Fort Worth resident Bud Land reported spotting Pete on the southern bank of the river, just west of the University Drive Bridge. While this location is just outside the zoo's perimeter but within the park, by the time anyone arrived, Pete was long gone. But as Land explains, he was certain that it was Pete.
"I can't help but be sure with a thing that size."
By Sunday morning, the police reported having received a flood of phone calls from anxious citizens, all wondering if Pete had been caught yet. He had not. Some speculated that Pete might have entered one of the numerous sewer openings in the area, and that prompted a thorough search of them. Again, there was no sign of Pete. Eamon Carter, publisher of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, and his son Eamon Jr. put up a reward of $500 for the safe return of Pete the python to the zoo. Now, $500 is about $5,800 today. $250 of that went to whomever located the snake and called zoo officials. And the other $250 went to the crew that safely captured him. Should anyone cite Pete, Zoo Director Ham Hitson announced that 3 telephone tip lines had been set up. They were Fortune 8341, Wilson 5106, or Cedar 7 2103. But Hitson warned that any attempt to capture Pete could result in severe injury. In other words, leave that to the experts. Amazingly, Python Pete's disappearance did little to scare off visitors to the zoo. The crowd on Monday, September 20th, 1954, that's 2 days after his disappearance, it was of the typical size for that day. Meanwhile, zoo officials and police were kept busy hunting down all the tips that they had been receiving. There was one report that Pete had been seen in the nearby Colonial Country Club, but that was a dead-end lead. Then some boys reported seeing the snake on the side of the road as they drove through Forest Park, and they claimed that he slithered into the underbrush. Well, the police and dozens of searchers scoured the area, but once again there was no sign of Pete. Then a man named Cloy Holloway said that he saw a large snake swimming porpoise-style near the dam at Benbrook Lake, which is about a 20-minute drive from the zoo. Well, it seemed unlikely that Pete could have traveled that far, but Ham Hitson led a party that thoroughly searched the scene. And no surprise here, it proved to be another wild goose chase. But nothing tops the call the police received from a woman in Monroe, Louisiana. She said that her daughter had used her Ouija board to locate Pete, and he could be found in the Forest Park area behind Jack's Bar. Well, an officer explained why this couldn't be true.
"There ain't no such animal as Jack's Bar."
One woman suggested there really was a simple way to find the python. All you need to do is start at the snake's home, head southward, and stop at the first railroad trestle. As she explained,
All snakes, when they escape, go in a southeasterly direction and stop at the first railroad trestle.
A Bell helicopter was brought in and circled at a low altitude. The thinking was that the strong winds produced by its propeller would dislodge Pete from whatever tree he might be in, but unfortunately no snakes were observed falling to the ground. The headline news the next day, and this is Tuesday, was the arrival of 8 carloads of Kappa Sigma fraternity members from the Southern Methodist University, and they stormed into town with their girlfriends to offer their assistance. Their first stop was the Hotel Texas, which is the Hilton Fort Worth today. Armed with butterfly nets and fencing foils, they hooted and hollered as they peeked into decorative urns and looked under the furniture for any sign of Pete. And when he couldn't be found there, they moved a few blocks away to the Worth Theater. And again, no sign of Pete at the theater, so they moved on to Forest Park, where some news photographers snapped their pictures. That's when Johnny Torbett, the frat member who put this misguided safari together, announced,
"Naturally, we're annoyed at not capturing the monster, but we want to say that we hold an open standing bid for Pete in Sigma Kappa. We'll give him a free ride. No deuce if you get what I mean, see?"
He then glanced down at his watch and declared,
"It's time to go back to Dallas."
Well, at least they were gone. That evening, police responded to a snake sighting on West 7th Street. Now, I will confirm it was a big snake. That is, it was a big stuffed snake. Seems that a used car dealer was using it as a publicity stunt. By Wednesday, the decision was made to reduce the intensity of the search. As Harry Jackson explained,
It's physically impossible to be everywhere at once. We're waiting for a new lead.
But part of the reason may have been due to fatigue. You see, Harry hadn't been to his home in Burleson since Pete escaped 5 days earlier. Next, a sound truck equipped with spotlights was added to the search effort. As the truck drove around the zoo and the surrounding park, it emitted a high-pitched signal that was inaudible to most human ears. Think dog whistles. Interestingly, even Pete would be unable to hear it. But as driver Clifford Herring explained,
"It should make him awfully uncomfortable and shake him up enough to get moving. Once he does, we'll spot him with the lights."
This effort to capture Pete failed, but it did have one unintended effect. That is, it drove the rats living near the river nuts. Clifford Herring again.
"We'd turn on the sound and the rats would run around in circles, jumping up and down."
Meanwhile, Snake Man Harry didn't seem too concerned about the ongoing search.
Pete will show up. We'll get him.
That afternoon, James L. Walden found a 10-foot or about 3-meter fake snake behind his company's building in nearby Trinity Park. It had been constructed of several lengths of inner tube and stuffed with old newspapers and magazines. Ham Hitson speculated that someone may have been pulling it through the underbrush as a prank. That same evening, police apprehended a group of teenagers along University Drive, also in Trinity Park, as they attempted to tie a 15-foot or 4.6-meter long canvas snake to a tree. Officers suspected that the snake had been stolen from that used car dealership the previous night. That dealer reported that several carloads of teenagers had visited his lot under the pretense of buying a car, but instead they stole his sawdust-filled snake when he wasn't looking. Now, Thursday, September 23rd, 1954 wasn't a good day for the zoo. That's because the city council ordered Harry Jackson to make his reptile exhibit escape-proof. That decision required Harry to kill 3 water moccasins and a rattlesnake, the only poisonous snakes in his collection at that time. Of course, with Pete the Python's escape making news worldwide, businesses attempted to cash in on his fame. For example, the Wally Williams clothing store ran an advertisement for designer stiletto shoes that was supposedly made from pearlized Calcutta lizards. But they did include the following little message, quote, "We guarantee the shoes are not made of Pete the Python," unquote. Or how about this one from Frank C. Bliss & Company in their advertising for 2- and 3-bedroom homes? "Where, oh where is Pete the Python? There is a rumor that he heard about the sensational home values in Eastwood Addition, almost everyone has, and busted out to try and make his way to one of those comfortable new FHA homes. We think Pete has a good idea. Why don't you come out today and inspect these fine homes? You probably won't see Pete, but you'll see 2 and 3 bedroom homes that you'll be proud to own. It's open house all day. The Hatley Motor Company in Bonham, Texas claimed, I don't know where Pete the Python is, but he's probably headed for Hatley's. And you can add to that list of people trying to cash in with Pete the Python t-shirts, Pete burgers, well, you get the idea. Meanwhile, back to the hunt for Pete. The problem was that with each passing day, there were fewer and fewer leads coming in, and that also meant that the press coverage was decreasing. The next big sighting was on Friday, October 1st of 1954. That's 13 days after Pete had escaped. It was 59-year-old Dallas resident David W. Smith who reported seeing the snake swimming in the Trinity River north of Arlington, Texas.
I was standing on the bridge when I spotted this big brown snake 15 or 20 feet long and as big as a stovepipe swimming toward a bend in the river. I watched him until he rounded the bend about 500 feet away.
Harry Jackson, who had just returned home for only the second time since Pete escaped, and I should add that the first time was by helicopter simply so he could lock his door. Anyway, he had come home to hop into the bath. He was just about to get in when he got the call.
I had just turned the water on when Robert Bransom of Burleson drove up and told me about the hunt. I jumped in my car and cut across country to the bridge.
Just like deja vu, a thorough search was conducted, but there was still no sign of Pete. Now, we'll probably never know if Harry returned home after this to take that bath, but one thing was certain of is that he was sleeping each night on a cot in the office of the Children's Zoo. Then, around 4 a.m. on Sunday, October 3rd, 1954, Harry was awoken by the screams of a chimpanzee named Al. His wailing alerted the other animals, and they all joined in with the screaming. That's when Harry and night watchman Ed Baker jumped into action.
I was too startled that I'd gotten halfway across the room before I knew why.
They found Al keeping his eye focused towards the south, so the 2 men headed off in that direction. And then at about 125 feet or 38.1 meters from Al's cage, the beam of Harry's flashlight spotted the snake. He was in an area that had been cleared for the construction of a new ape house. Ed Baker kept the beam of light focused on Pete as Harry slipped the loop around the snake's head. Once it was secure, he asked Ed to go call for help. It would be about 20 minutes before anyone arrived, and Pete managed to slip out of the loop once, Harry explained.
I was afraid I might break his neck. When I let up a little, he ducked out.
They dragged Pete the Python to a temporary cage, and his 15 days on the lam had come to an end. After an examination, Harry noticed that Pete's mouth looked like it may once again be infected. So 5 hours after his capture with the assistance of 8 helpers, they pinned the snake down. Harry then proceeded to clean out the snake's mouth, but Pete clearly was not happy with the situation, and he bit his owner's right thumb. A crowd of about 50 people quietly looked on as Jackson completed Pete's treatment. All the time the blood was trickling down his hand. And afterward, as a preventative, Harry was taken to get a tetanus shot. He overheard someone call Pete vicious, to which Harry replied,
How would you feel if 6 or 8 guys grabbed you and threw you down? Wouldn't you fight back? He's not vicious.
Needless to say, Pete the Python became the star attraction at the Forest Park Zoo. Throngs of people showed up to catch a glimpse of him, but unfortunately the large crowds prevented most of them from getting a good look. When one spectator questioned Harry as to where Pete had been all that time, he responded,
Ask Pete. He's the only one who knows.
After wintering in the monkey house, Pete was still the most popular draw at the zoo the following year. But Harry received some bad news. The Dallas Zoo claimed they now had a python that was longer than Pete. And if that were true, that could potentially steer the crowds away from the Fort Worth Zoo. So Harry came up with a stunt to get Pete's name back in the papers. He bet the Dallas Zoo that Pete had grown to at least 20 feet or 6.1 meters in length. And if he didn't measure up, Harry promised to eat the snake. Well, 350 people attended a public ceremony on Saturday, August 13th of 1955 to determine Pete's true length. And sadly, he came up a bit short. He measured only 19 feet 8 1/4 inches long, not 20 feet. He was 3 3/4 inches or 9.53 centimeters too short. You know what that means? Harry had to eat the snake. No, he never did. Instead, he came up with the following excuse as to why he wouldn't have to do so.
We didn't get all the kinks out.
Fast forward to New Year's Eve of 1957. That's 3 years, 3 months, and 13 days after Pete's escape. The big news was that Pete was no longer Pete. He had a new name, Patricia. And that's because Pete had given birth to 75 white eggs. And since only the ladies can do that, it was clear that Pete was a female. Harry Jackson told the press,
I knew he was mean, but I didn't know he was a female. I just can't get used to calling him a her.
It was unknown if the eggs were fertile or not. Now, there was a much smaller python in the cage with her, as Harry pointed out.
Besides, I don't know what sex it is either. After what's happened with Pete, I wouldn't guess. That little one doesn't even have a name.
But he just had to know if those eggs were fertile or not. So on Friday, January 10th of 1958, one of her eggs was opened up and inside they found, can you guess, a well-developed snake embryo. They were fertile. Sadly, Patricia would never get to see her eggs hatch. On Sunday morning, February 23, 1958, she passed away at an unknown age. The reality is no one had any clue how old she was. But her death wasn't a surprise. It turns out that she hadn't eaten anything in 6 months and died of starvation. Now, they did try to force feed her 5 days before her death, but sadly it was too late. Now, Patricia's eggs were placed in an incubator, but they began to rot away. It was announced on March 26, 1958, that all the putrid eggs had been buried. And what that really meant was that there weren't any Pats or Petes to continue on the family legacy. Then came the question as to what to do with the snake's body. I mean, the thing was huge. Harry called a taxidermist who quoted him $10 per foot. But at a length of 21 feet, that would have been $210 in total. That's nearly $2,300 today. But that was simply too much for Harry. That's when the Fort Worth Zoological Society stepped forward and offered to pick up the cost of having Pete mounted. I should note that the name Patricia never caught on. They gave the job to taxidermist Kelton Tilley, and he agreed to do so at cost. The final product was then gifted to the city for display at the zoo. As for Pete's internal organs and skeleton, they were donated to TCU, that's a Texas Christian University, and of course an autopsy was performed. What they found was shocking. Pete had been infested with worms, and that included a total of 150 feet or 45.72 meters of tapeworm. No wonder that snake wouldn't eat. Now, Pete the Python did make one final appearance. Well, sort of an appearance. That was on Friday, April 25th, 1958, during a TCU Science Department open house. Among the 100 exhibits, the main attraction was a display case featuring Pete's skeleton and several jars containing his preserved internal organs. And while it might sound a bit gross, you can check out a video of the event on my website, uselessinformation.org, and you'll see that his remains, they were tastefully presented. But personally, I would have preferred that Pete be laid to rest by the river, where he could eternally bask in the sunshine. Useless, useful, I'll leave that for you to decide. Just a quick note that there are 10 different videos covering the escape, manhunt, and death of Pete the Python, and they're available online in the University of North Texas's digital library. They were originally broadcast on Fort Worth TV station WBAP, which is their NBC affiliate. I should point out that all the footage is silent, but they do have the transcripts scanned in so you can read those as you're watching the footage. But honestly, if you've heard the story, you don't even need the transcripts. They're kind of self-explanatory. Anyway, I'll place a link to the videos in both the show notes and the Pete the Python story on my Useless Information website. I also wanted to quickly mention that I'll be giving a free talk at the Canaan Historical Society in Canaan, New York on Sunday, July 28th at 2 p.m. I'll be presenting a few of my favorite stories there, and I should note that it's not going to be a new presentation. If you've gone to any of my presentations at Hudson Valley Community College, I'm planning on presenting the first lecture that I did there, and I'm guessing that's probably about a year and a half ago or so. I should also add that I'm also scheduled to give my fourth talk at Hudson Valley Community College on Friday, November 8th at 9:30 a.m., but they do charge for that one. I seem to recall last semester they charged $14. Now that presentation will be brand new. I'm going to choose a whole new set of stories, different from what I've told there before. But free is always my favorite choice, so if you happen to be anywhere near Canaan, that's basically near Chatham, New York, I'd love for you to join us. You can find the Useless Information Podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and now that does include YouTube. If you just happen to be listening to me right now through one of the many apps out there, I'd greatly appreciate it if you'd hit the subscribe button. You can also follow the podcast on both Facebook and X, plus you can contact me via email at steve@uselessinformation.org. That's steve@uselessinformation.org. And there's also a contact form on my website, uselessinformation.org. And just a reminder that the Useless Information Podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. So be sure to visit airwavemedia.com where you'll find a curated selection of some of the best podcasts out there. As always, thanks for listening and take care, everyone. Bye.